Final Project, a fantasy basketball assistant by Reed Feldman and Ben Eckhart. So, the first step in creating a fantasy basketball assistant algorithm was to understand how fantasy basketball works in the first place. So, fantasy basketball is an online competition in which competitors can select NBA players or draft NBA players to their team at the start of each NBA season. Then these fantasy team owners have the ability to trade players with another team or add unowned free agents to their team so long as they drop a player at the same time. This is sort of a way to increase your chances of winning the next game. So, for each week, every team plays against one other team for that week. The stats that your players accumulate in real NBA games make up the stats for your fantasy team. 9 different statistics are considered, which can be seen on the chart on the next page. To win a weekly matchup against your opponent, your team must win at least 5 of these 9 categories.
This is what a team may look like on any given night. A few things to note are that one, some players play and some players don't on nights, on different nights. It's not like football where every team plays on Sunday. The next thing to note is that some players here are what we call permanent players, and other players are temporary players. Permanent players are going to be your stars. For instance, Russell Westbrook or Anthony Davis, if you know them. Uh, the next type of player is a temporary player. These are going to be your weaker players. Um, I tend to think that I don't have very many on my team, but in this case, you might think of them as Rondé Hollis Jefferson and Ish Smith. So, what happens is that when you have guys, your temporary players who don't play, then what you want to do is just drop them and add players who do play that day, because a player who doesn't play contributes nothing to your team, and if he's weak enough that you don't need to have him for the rest of the season, you might as well drop him for someone who will contribute to your team that night.
So the goal of each week against your respective opponent is to win the matchup, obviously. So what does it mean to win a matchup in fantasy basketball? So to win a fantasy basketball matchup, you have to win the majority of the categories that are counted towards each week. So 5 out of the 9 categories your team must win in order to win that game. So, in order to win one of the categories, it works sort of like the electoral college system, in which that if you have 30 assists and your team only counts for 29, you record the whole category opposed to that one assist differential. So, let's say you win that assist category, you win points category, you win rebounds category, steals, and blocks. That would be enough to win the matchup, even though you might have lost the field goal percentage category by 20%. So if you win the majority, which is 5 out of the 9 categories, it's a winner take all basis. So you would win that week.
Of course, the short term goal in fantasy basketball is to win the matchup, but the long term goal and the real goal is to be the champion of your league. And the way you do that is first by making the playoffs. You make the playoffs by having a top four record. And when we say record, we mean your total wins, your total losses. The number of categories is not contributed. So, like, you won more categories than someone, but you had less total wins. Sorry, you're out of luck. The regular season is approximately 20 weeks, and then the playoffs begin. And then once you're in the playoffs, you have to have a team that's capable of winning the championship. And in the playoffs, matchups are formatted the same way: 9 categories, win 5, you advance to the next round. And the champion of the league receives money and bragging rights for a year, not to be underestimated.
So there are 2 strategies to take into consideration for each matchup. There's a short-term strategy and there's also a long-term strategy. Short-term strategies usually consist of picking up free agents that are not currently on anyone's roster. So when you pick up a free agent, you do so after analyzing your opponent's matchup and seeing which categories will be close. You can think of these close categories sort of as swing states. So, for example, if you are projected to have 20 assists and your opponent's team is projected to have 19 assists, it would be advantageous for you to pick up a player of free agency that has a high number of assists so that you can win that category. Whereas certain categories like rebounds, if your team has 10 and the other team is projected to have 20, it would not make sense to pick up someone on free agency because this category is already most likely a wash. The next strategy for a matchup is long term, and long-term strategies are usually done through a trade. So, like Ben said in the last slide, when you're looking towards a championship and playoff run, it's important to have players on your roster that you think would be good for matchups against other teams down the road.
Now, when we're looking to add players for the week, it's difficult to predict which categories you should focus on until later in the week once stats have begun to accumulate. This is due to two reasons. First, teams change so much due to trading that simply looking at the team's recent performance is not a perfect indicator of how it will perform with its current roster. If you could know this prior to the start of the week, though, it would give you a few days head start in targeting that statistic over your opponent. The next reason it's hard is because each team plays a different number of games each week. So how a team did last week could be very different than how they will do this week, because some guys in their team might have played 2 games last week, whereas now they're going to play 4 games this week. And if you look at this bottom matchup, if I could have known, well, clearly it was a very close matchup. It was 5-4, and 2 of the categories, rebounds and points, were extremely close. If I could have known at the start of the week on Monday that those 2 categories were going to be the closest, I could have dropped some players on my team that were maybe excellent at assists and steals because I won those by so much, and I could have added someone that was good at rebounding and scoring.
In the last slide, we discussed the difficulties associated with picking up free agents that are not currently on a roster. This is where our code and the fantasy assistant can help. It acts as a matchup predictor. The first step of this matchup predictor is to get all of the data for each free agent or for each player and their respective NBA game schedule. We did this by scraping the HTML off of ESPN's data table. Next, we input the week and the matchup of the opposing team, which we select. So as you can see down below, randomly we selected week 16 and with team TDB and team pool. Next, our algorithm found every player on the 2 teams and the number of games that they will play that week. And it's important to note that these players are healthy, because injured players obviously cannot contribute to a statistic if they're not on the court at all. Next we found that one player's contribution to his team, which is the per game stats multiplied by the number of games that were played that week. And next, the sum of all players' contribution for both teams was calculated. In the last step, we found the difference between the 2 teams for each category. The result for this final step can be displayed below. So here are the challenges to executing effective trades. When considering a potential trade, it is difficult to predict how this trade will influence your chances against all other teams, because obviously there are an incredible number of scenarios to consider when you're looking at each team and each of that team's respective stats. So obviously certain trades will benefit you against some teams and hurt you against others, depending on the matchup and depending on a team's strengths and their weaknesses. So as a result, the things to consider in executing an effective trade is, does this trade give me an advantage when I am playing key opponents. What we mean by that, but what we mean by a key opponent is someone that is seen as a dominant team in the league, or someone that you think that you will need to beat when making a championship run. In other words, a key opponent is someone that will make the playoffs. The next thing to consider is, can you afford the damage it will cause me against another? So what this means is that when you trade for a player, like anything else, it has its benefits and it also has its downsides. So this is basically asking, is is benefiting your team in certain ways worth the negatives that it will cause you against other matchups?
The next feature of the Fantasy Assistant is its trade analyzer. The first step to analyzing a trade, however, is seeing how your team compares to the other teams before the trade. So the way the Fantasy Assistant compares teams is by first getting data on all the players. Like in the matchup predictor, obviously, that's a step that is used for all of them. Next is to input the team of interest. Obviously, this is most often going to be your team because you're interested in seeing how your team would it be affected by the trade. Next is that one player's contribution to his team is going to be his per game stats. Note that it's not his per game stats times the number of games he'll be playing that week, because we want to take the variation kind of out of play here. We want to say just in general, how does my team compare to another team, not how does my team compare to another team this week. Next, we'll sum all the players' contributions to the team, getting their totals. And then for each other team, we want to find the difference between the team, between my team and that team for each category. So what this means is if my team has a total of 160 steals, or not 160, that's a lot, 50 steals, and theirs has 40, then my team would win by 10 steals, essentially. And then the next step is just marking how many categories the team would win and how many it would lose. So here is an outcome of the program for Triple Double Boys. It shows how their team would generally, on average, do against all the other teams. And as you can see, obviously, when I play TDB, I would tie all 9 categories. All the other ones represent a legitimate matchup. So I might see from here that Team Barrett and Team Pula, the two where I'm either predicted to have on average a 4-5 matchup or a 5-4 matchup, that those are the teams I should be concerned about. And I'll say it's not a coincidence that those are the teams that I've notified are key opponents, because they're the teams that I will be in the playoffs against.
So in this slide, we show what a possible trade might look like. Here, we selected randomly 2 players to give away from our roster, Russell Westbrook and Kristaps Porzingis, in which we would get in return Isaiah Thomas and Marc Gasol. So, in doing so, one could calculate by hand the certain plus minus in each of the 9 major categories. And although this can be done, A, it's very time consuming, and B, it doesn't really tell the full story or the big picture. Because while it's easy to see that I might be gaining 2.7% in field goal percentage, it's difficult to know whether that 2.7% increase in field goal percentage is worth the negative 9 rebounds that you're losing. Because in certain categories, in certain matchups, 9 rebounds may be much more important than an increase in 2.7% field goal. So as a result, doing this by hand is truly ineffective, which makes our algorithm kind of have a niche or purpose.
Now, the next step in analyzing the trade is seeing, like Reed said, how these increases and decreases in certain stats are going to affect your team against the other teams, especially your key opponents. So the way the team compare works after a trade is very simple. First, you enter the proposed trade into the program, and then what it will do is it subtracts the outgoing player stats for my team and adds the incoming player stats to my team. And it does that for both teams, obviously. And then it simply runs the team compare, which we saw earlier, except now we'll have new totals. So we'll get new scores against all the other teams. So going back to our trade we just saw, even though we won some categories and lost some categories, what happened was that it improved our chances of beating one of our key opponents, Barrett. If you remember, it was 4-5 last time, so he was on average projected to beat us 5-4. Now after this trade, on average, we'll probably beat him 5-4. And another important thing is that it didn't hurt us when we play Team Pula, who's our other key opponent that we've chosen. It was 5-4 before with him, and it will still be 5-4 after the trade. So what we see is that we should accept this trade. Fantasy Assistant will help you win your current matchup and win your future matchups when you're in the playoffs trying to make a run for the big bucks. Thank you for watching.
This copyrighted telecast of the National Basketball Association is intended solely for the entertainment of our audience and